Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd really like to compliment my colleague across for a very heart-wrenching speech, one that came from his heart and involved a lot of people. And I think he is so correct in what he said. Every time we have an accident and someone is killed by an impaired driving, it's not only those victims, but the victims that have to live on. Thank you very much for that, and it was a great story. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House to speak on M148, which would establish a National Impaired Driving Prevention Week. As you all know, I spent 35 years as an RCMP officer, and as an emergency responder, I have personally witnessed the prevalence and the impacts of impaired driving. I attended too many fatal MVAs directly related to impaired driving. Even had the occasion once to charge an individual with a breathalyzer reading 6 times over the legal limits. Scary, he wasn't supposed to be walking. I'm grateful that this motion has been put forward, Mr. Speaker, and I am pleased to see that it appears to have the support on all sides of this House, as it should. Impaired driving is not a problem in Canada. It's not a new problem in Canada, Mr. Speaker. It has been recognized by the Criminal Code of Canada since 1921. Despite a sizable drop in impaired driving rates since the mid-1980s, it still remains a leading cause of criminal death in Canada. In my own province of Alberta, 1 in 5 drivers involved in fatal collisions between 2011 and 2015 had been drinking prior to the collision. In that same time period, 389 people were killed and 5,969 people were injured in alcohol-related collisions. These numbers are unacceptable. In a Statistics Canada survey, 1 out of 20 drivers in Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Yukon, and the Nunavut admitted to driving in previous years after consuming 2 or more drinks in an hour before driving. And it is clear, Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of repeat offenders. Out of these individuals, more than 3/4 reported driving impaired on multiple occasions. On one occasion, I can remember, I arrested a person 3 times in one night for impaired driving. The only way to stop him was to lock him up finally. This motion states that the government should recognize the importance of educating Canadians about the consequences of impaired driving. And that is so right. With a good education program, we can lower the statistical data out there and get that information across. Very much like we did with the seat belts. When seat belts came out, good educational program got the message out there. From the stats I just shared, 95% of Canadians seem to understand the consequences of drunk driving. But we need to keep educating the public until that number is 100%. Because the 5% who keep driving while driving and drinking are doing a lot of damage and permanently changing the lives of thousands of people, as my friend across just said. And it's not just alcohol that impairs our driving. Our cell phones are a huge distraction on the road. The distraction greatly impacts our ability to drive safely, and we're impairing that ability. According to the Canadian Automobile Association, drivers who text are 23 times more likely to be involved in a crash or a near miss. I have witnessed ladies applying makeup, men shaving, and some unmentionable distractions while people were driving. This motion is well timed with Bill 373, which I will also be speaking on when it is up for debate later this month. It calls for a national framework to deter and prevent distracted drivers with the focus of handheld devices. Distracted driving is a major issue across Canada. The number of deaths caused by distracted drivers is now outpacing those caused by drunk drivers in the provinces like Ontario and British Columbia. It is imperative that we include distracted driving in our conversations about impaired driving. If this motion passes and we have a National Impaired Driving Prevention Week, this is something I would like to see part of the conversation each year. I would also like to see drug-impaired driving as part of this conversation. This is an issue I can be very concerned about as the Liberal government pushes to legalize marijuana. Drug-impaired driving has been increasing every year since 2009. I think the message about drinking and driving is well known, but people do not fully understand the impacts that drugs can and will have on their judgment and reaction time when driving. Studies of vehicle accidents around the world show that the drugs most commonly found in drivers involved in accidents include marijuana, opioids, and cocaine. Each drug affects the brain differently, but all impact the user's attention, judgment, and motor skills, reaction time, decision-making skills, and coordination. Public Safety Canada conducted research with Canadians on the drug-impaired driving in 2017. They found that 28% of cannabis users have operated a vehicle while under the influence, and 1/3 of Canadians have ridden in vehicles operated by a driver who was affected by the use of cannabis. Among those who have driven while impaired, almost half downplayed the risks. They either indicated that driving while under the influence of cannabis is less dangerous than driving while under the influence of alcohol, or they believe that driving while under the influence of cannabis posed no real risk to them or anybody else. They are wrong. I've investigated horrific accidents, no liquor, but drivers were high. These are the attitudes of Canadians, and it needs to change, especially as marijuana becomes legal. This is why I support educating Canadians about the dangers of impaired driving. I know there are members here who have personally been impacted by the impaired driver, and we have heard that. Some have lost a friend or a family member. The sponsor of this motion almost lost his daughter, a story that he shared with this House. What is even more heartbreaking than this story is the fact that there are thousands of more stories like his out there. So many Canadians have been impacted by impaired driving in life-changing ways. This is something that needs to change. During my service as an RCMP officer, some of my worst memories are motor vehicle accidents, death, and mangled bodies. You never forget. A National Impaired Driving Prevention Week would serve as an annual reminder and an education campaign of the very real consequences of driving while impaired, whether by drugs, alcohol, or by distractions. When the sponsor of this motion spoke in November of last year, he said that 4 Canadians die in an impaired driving accident each day. That's too much. If a single life can be saved by this motion, then it is worth supporting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I encourage all members of this House to support M148 and help make our roads safe.